Why are there so few women in wildlife photography? Or maybe you haven't even noticed. The truth is, wildlife photography is still a man-dominated field. But which are the reasons behind this? Do people even realize the challenges women face? In case you don't know, my name is Chiara and I've been doing wildlife photography for the past 4 years, and recently I quit my job to do wildlife photography and teaching wildlife photography full-time. Of course, I had my personal experience, but what about the others? So I thought, well, I'll just ask them. This is why I conducted an anonymous survey within the wildlife photography community. The goal? Evaluating if and how gender can have an effect on wildlife photography, and especially to learn about the actual experience from others. I conducted this anonymous survey, and of the 323 respondents, 65% were men, 34% were women, and 1% non-binary. I think this distribution perfectly reflects the overall numbers and gender representation in wildlife photography. Of course, it is possible there is some bias since the survey was conducted mainly within my community, although a few people also shared it within theirs. For transparency, for example, men represent 70% of my community on Instagram and 90% on YouTube. These numbers also totally align with my experience when I'm actually out in the field and I meet way less women. But the question is, do people actually perceive this? Before going ahead, I have to make a small technical disclaimer. For the next graphs, only answers from men and women are included. This is because there were only 5 answers from non-binary people. Therefore, a numerical analysis with such a small sample size is very difficult and scientifically relevant. But of course, I will describe this data later on during the video because, of course, also this perspective is very important. So now we know already the gender distribution is very skewed, but do people realize this? Most, but actually not everyone. In the survey, I asked if people agree with the sentence, the majority of wildlife photographers are men. And you can see that most agreed with the sentence, but actually men looked less likely to recognize there are less women wildlife photographers. I also asked people to evaluate their level in wildlife photography in a scale from 1 to 5 and for how long they've been doing it. You can see there is a good variety and you can see the skill level, of course, going up with time. People tended to equally score their level irrespective of gender. This was very interesting because, for example, in bird watching, research showed men tend to report they can identify more birds, but it doesn't look the same for wildlife photography. Then I asked how much they agreed with the sentence, it is more challenging for a woman to be a wildlife photographer, and here you can see a large gap in answers. 50% of women agreed, but most of men actually disagreed with this statement. Wildlife photography is an activity which of course requires being out in nature, sometimes in remote places, and also traveling. I asked how people felt about safety. If almost 60% of men never felt unsafe, the percentage dropped to 40% for women. Then I asked specific questions on reflecting on if and how gender had an effect on their activity as wildlife photographers. The vast majority of men reported their being a man didn't play a role. 14% recognized a positive advantage and 9% a disadvantage. I'll share more insight on this data later on. Women's perspective is largely different, with more than 60% of women reporting a negative effect associated with their gender. I analyzed all the answers coming from women and I summarized the main recurring themes. The most recurring theme was safety concerns. And here I'm reading one of the answers I received. It happens that I avoid certain areas for the fear of going in the field alone and at the end giving up, not going at all. Women may not feel safe when venturing alone into locations, especially remote ones, and there's discomfort or fear of being alone in nature, especially due to the risk of encountering people, risk of harassment, or being assaulted. This is why women often report doing wildlife photography only when together with their husband, boyfriend, or friends. The second theme was general gender stereotypes and bias. Here again we read one of the answers. I have noticed some men with less experience than me explaining things I know because they assume I wouldn't have that amount of knowledge. There is a perception that women are less capable or knowledgeable, especially in the technical aspects of photography. Female photographers also report feeling excluded or marginalized in male-dominated photography settings such as workshops or group outings, and they often experience mansplaining or just being taken less seriously. Another big barrier women face is the one represented by the traditional gender roles. The traditional roles that women have played in society, such as caregiving responsibilities, family responsibilities, just hinder their ability to dedicate time and resources to wildlife photography. Also, traditional gender norms may discourage women from pursuing outdoor activities which have been traditionally associated with men. Of course, the fact that there are so few women photographers result in a general lack of representation and recognitions. There's a scarcity of women wildlife photographers, meaning that there's also less role models and women mentors for other women. This is also because normally women's work is undervalued or dismissed when compared to the one coming from men, which inevitably affects their possibility of career progression. Generally, women wildlife photographers face more barriers in career advancements, with fewer opportunities for publications, awards, or general professional recognition. In this regard, there is a beautiful article written by Melissa Grew a couple of years ago, which I'm linking down in the description, which analyzes the gender barrier in regards to access of women in wildlife photography competitions. But women also face some physical challenges and access barriers. For example, something which was often mentioned is the weight of camera equipment and carrying it over long distances, which can limit their mobility and overall endurance in the field. Also, access to remote locations may be limited due to logistical difficulties. Many women mention they don't go to certain places, for example, when they are on their period. Now, you might remember that I asked if people agreed with the statement that being in wildlife photography is harder for a woman. Although the majority of men didn't agree with this sentence, those who did were actually able to identify pretty well the things that we saw already in the answers from women. So indeed, it looks like some male photographers really express empathy and understanding towards the challenges which women face, particularly in terms of safety concerns, but also the more general social perceptions. Some men photographers acknowledge that they feel safer than women when being out in nature, especially into remote areas, or also being out late, for example. A few respondents also mentioned the financial advantages associated with being men, suggesting that, of course, this is related to more resources to invest in their photography adventures. This is just part of a much bigger problem, which is the gender pay gap, for which men are typically more paid than women, and we all know that wildlife photography is a very, very expensive activity. So it makes sense that those who have more financial powers will have more possibilities of doing it, or for example, buying gear or traveling. Some men also mentioned their physical advantages, such as being able to carry heavy camera equipment, or also finding it just easier to relieve themselves when they're outdoor. But this is not just a video about women's challenges. As you've seen, about 10% of men actually reported they had negative experiences related to their gender. So, of course, I also want to share their perspective. The most mentioned thing was about perception and stereotypes. Respondents discussed some perceptions of men with cameras, including assumptions of being a threat or being viewed with suspicion, particularly around children or in public space. Also, a few respondents mentioned there is too much competition among male photographers, and they refer to toxic masculinity, and some also note a lack of support and network. Another theme that was mentioned by a few people was actually social media challenges. Male photographers express difficulties in growing their social media presence and their perception that actually women are favored in this space. Now we move to the non-binary perspective. As mentioned earlier, 5 respondents were non-binary. This number was just too low to make any mathematical analysis, but of course it's necessary also to share these answers. As you can see, the majority recognize there are less women in wildlife photography and that this is more challenging for women. When it comes to the actual challenges experienced, some of them overlapped with the themes discussed earlier for women, as the safety concerns concerns and mansplaining. But for example, they also mentioned that they avoid some popular places specifically because they are non-binary and they experience either too much attention or lack of respect because of their gender, to the point that some decide to hide it. Now, while analyzing the data from this survey, as a woman, I found both some very well-known things and experiences, but on the other hand, I was also surprised a bit. I remember very well when I was just starting wildlife photography 4 years ago, started to ask myself, why do I meet only men? I thought it was just an impression at the beginning, but that turned out to be the reality. Safety has been a huge barrier for myself. For a very long time, I went out only when my boyfriend was with me. With time, I gained more confidence and overcome some of those fears of being alone. However, I have surely given up on going into some places or staying out until certain hours, and still there are these places where I wouldn't go by myself. So I definitely think this has impacted my activity, and sometimes I do wonder, what if when I started wildlife photography I didn't have a boyfriend? Perhaps I would have continued, but my progress would have been much slower, simply because being out is necessary to make progress. When it comes to other gender barriers, I may say that, as also many other women have reported, I felt feelings of insecurity when it came to meet groups of men photographers. It is weird to explain, but I always felt like I just couldn't fit in. I felt as I was little, questioning what I was doing there with my small camera and lens. Occasionally I felt underestimated by men and experienced mansplaining. I don't have lots of experiences because actually, as a choice, have been by myself all the time, avoiding content, which can actually be maybe a sign something's not great. But in those few occasions, I definitely felt I wasn't taken seriously, and the assumption I wasn't good at it or I didn't have anything relevant to say or add about photography, when in fact I had. Physical strength is also a theme that resonates with me. I have to admit, I am weak. Gear is a problem, and again, I admit I let my boyfriend carry it when I'm with him. But thankfully, I was able to purchase a setup which is lighter, and unfortunately, there are not many lightweight combinations that don't involve a big compromise with quality, so I totally understand how this could limit the activity of other women. Overall, being a woman, I feel very privileged because I was and I am in a position where I don't have or have overcome some of the barriers other women still experience. And I made this survey not for women, but for everyone really. It's also been extremely interesting to learn about the perspectives coming from everyone. I think that sometimes we just don't take time to listen to each other. So I think it's very clear that barriers and stereotypes are there, but they can be broken. But first we need to know about them. And I'm very hopeful about the future because I can see change happening in front of my eyes. But if we work together, we can definitely accelerate it. And this video, as my online activity, is just my little way to contribute. Now, I would encourage everyone to talk to each other and to support each other, because at the end of the day, wildlife photography is what can bring us together, and I think that everyone can agree that wildlife photography can be really for everyone. Thank you so much for watching the video, and please leave a comment to share your perspective, your insight, your experience. Of course, not everyone maybe will agree with what I said, but also this is why we're here, for discussing. Let's keep it cute though. And of course, if you want to do something more practical, consider sharing this video within your wildlife photography friends or community to start this conversation with them too. Another way to practically show your support to women in wildlife photography, you can also subscribe to the channel. Thank you.